anything you'd like to say and hear some hopefully interesting responses from our guest panel here. So well, just a few rules and regs first of all. If you have a question to ask, obviously if you pop your hand up in the air. If you're on that side, Sheila will be roaming with a microphone. And if you're this side, I will be. If you could please wait until you get the microphone, and then when you've got it, obviously, then you may ask your question. If we could keep questions as brief as possible, so obviously if you've got something interesting to say, that's great, but once you get beyond the 10 minutes bit, we're going to intervene, all right? But before we start, however, we should introduce you to our panel. Some of these good people will be known to you, but some may not. So I think we'll begin. And first of all, I must begin by saying thank you to Hamish Miller here on my right, because Hamish has stepped in very late in the day. We should have had Robin Heath join us this evening. Robin is coming for Sunday, but sadly the alternator on his ancient van packed up, and he just wasn't able to make it down today. So Hamish very kindly has come in. Hamish will be known to many of you as author of many books about dowsing, earth mysteries and beyond, including books like It's Not Too Late. And he is also one of the co-founders of the Parallel Community Project, which we hopefully will be hearing about tomorrow evening when Hamish gives his presentation. So number one, Mr. Hamish Miller.
And our next guest panellist here is Jason Porthouse, who some of you will have recognised from being on the door. And he's been involved in crop circles for years and years and years, but I'm very glad to say he's now a resident of this area. He used to live in Sussex and now he's down here. And Jason is also a filmmaker, so he jets off all around the world and does marvellous things like that. Jason led the meditation for us this evening. Those of you who were here will remember how lovely that was. And he also opened the Symposium for us. I think it was last year. So there you go, Jason Porthouse.
Okay, this lady here to my right, this is Margaret Novacovic. Now, there's a sort of posse of people who've been involved for many years in mysteries research and crop circles and all of this, and they're crucially important, but you may not immediately know their names. But Margaret has been very much at the forefront of the London groups who've been looking into all of this. The London Centre for Crop Circle Studies, as it was originally, I think, apart from the Sussex group, is the longest running crop circle group, and it's now called the London Forum for Crop Circles. And Margaret's now been running it together with Sally, wherever Sally is, for the last few years now. There she is. Oh, hello, Sally. She does a marvellous job. I would say Margaret is a great facilitator. She's been fantastic. But we're really hoping tonight, this is her chance to actually hear what Margaret has to say. And she's very kindly agreed to come and join us. So, Margaret Novacovic.
And our next panellist is Linda Hull, who many of you would have heard speaking earlier today, particularly about the transition movement. Linda is one of our Glastonbury local politicians. She is a mover and shaker in the town, although she likes to hide her light under a bushel a little bit because she can be shy. But she's really doing a lot of great things in the town, helping to reskill the community and, in fact, helping to rebuild community. Ladies and gentlemen, Linda Hull.
And the gentleman here in the middle, obviously anybody who was here first thing this morning will know Mr. Ian Crane, but for those of you who've joined us since, Ian is very much at the forefront of trying to expose, shall we say, the manipulation and the agenda of control that seems to be foisted on us by those in power, and indeed the powers behind the powers. And he's currently stirring up lots of controversy and lots of interest and doing a grand job in trying to wake people up. So, Mr. Ian R. Crane. So, now we have them here, now we have your good selves here. Let's ask for some questions. So, hands up.
Oh,
right, gentlemen there. There we go.
Hi, this is probably a question for Ian. Ian, in terms of the information you're exposing about what's going on, do you find yourself being targeted? And if you do, would you like to give us some tips on how you go about handling this?
You know, that's one of the reasons I don't do Q&A sessions at the end of my talks, because that's a question that always comes up. The bottom line is, do I feel threatened? No. If anything occurs which threatens me in any way, shape or form, I'm just going to go, thank you, because now I know I'm right. You know, whilst I am pretty much left alone, then there's a possibility that I might be wrong, right? But, you know, at the end of the day, do I look frightened? You know, do I sound frightened? Listen, you know, I think these guys are running scared. You know, and I think that although I can't explain it in Newtonian terms, once we actually put ourselves out there and start speaking from the appropriate place, we have a hell of a lot of help from areas that we don't necessarily understand. And, you know, what is quite remarkable is the way in which information actually comes to us as well. You know, believe it or not, probably 30% of that presentation fell into place, no, not maybe 30%, maybe 20% fell into place probably in the last week, because I knew there were pieces of the jigsaw missing. And I just put out there that, you know, there's something here that doesn't gel with me. I haven't got the supporting evidence to make a particular statement, and I can guarantee that, you know, very quickly that evidence falls into my lap in one way, shape or form. How that works, I don't know. Am I grateful? Yes. But listen, I mean, these guys want us to be fearful. I mean, fear is the control mechanism. You know, and that's why I played the George Carlin clip. And of course, I didn't mention it, but George Carlin died just 1 month ago, 22nd of June. And, you know, here was a guy whose chosen medium for getting the message out there was comedy. And the great tragedy is that some people just saw him as a comedian, whereas the message that he was conveying was of vital importance. And one thing about George Carlin is he certainly, you know, never showed any fear. But, you know, the last statement he made was, you know, I want you to get angry. You know, I'm a human being, God damn it. And I think that this is really the space that, you know, we need to come from. And that's why, you know, I always say, please, just, you know, make the effort to educate yourself. Because once you understand the issue, then fear dissipates. You know, and that point forward, you take, you know, you take your power and you go wherever it takes you.
Do any other?
Can I just come in a little bit? I think he's an extremely courageous man. He didn't say that. But when the bit about fear dissipating only comes through your own courage. And he's not afraid to stick his head above the parapet and be shot at and be reviled almost. But I am in total admiration of his courage.
I was just going to say likewise that I think there's sometimes a wider issue here in that all of this information as it comes into us, it can be quite overwhelming and often put us into a state of fear and worry because we think, well, we're powerless to fight against this or anything like that. And one of the things that I've learned, certainly from, not directly from the crop circles, but they were a catalyst for learning much more about energies and how they work within us and that kind of thing, and the subtle energies and the interplay between that and physical manifestations we might have in the body and disease and that kind of thing. And I think there is a lot of valuable information out there about tools that we can use to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves in check, to see if we are falling foul of that. I mean, the last few months I think have been a great case in point with all of the credit crunch and all of this saturation that there is in the media about how bad things are and how we're all, you know, going to hell in a handcart in terms of the economy and all the rest of it. Putting aside the rights or wrongs of any of that, I've said to some friends of mine that it almost felt like you're kind of walking along a really, really narrow, sort of slippery precipice, and every so often your foot slips down one side because you're trying to hold an image in your mind and not fall foul of this saturation that's just bombarding us. In the media, I think there are, there's so many different things now that are affecting us in electromagnetic pollution, geopathic stress, all of these things. And one of the keys, I think, is to find the tools that work for you in order to keep you on the straight and narrow, and have the discipline to make sure that you maintain that. Because I think it's really easy for us, and I think, I was saying to somebody this morning, I can't remember who it was, that there's a sense that we've kind of trolled along in a nice kind of bubble for a little few years and everything's been okay, and now we're really having to step up to the mark and to start practicing what we preach and walking the talk and doing that in a very clear and clean way. So we've got to deal with our own stuff, and we've got to keep ourselves very focused and make sure that we don't fall foul of all these things that are coming around. And the tools are there to do it, and it's not difficult and it doesn't take a long time. But I think it's just a really important thing to keep that sense, so that it's not overwhelming and it doesn't sort of just swamp us in a sea of whatever that is.
Okay. Right, do we have a question from this side of the room? Yes, gentleman at the back who looks suspiciously like Richard Smith, who was on the panel last year. And here he is. He's going to get his word in anyway. Bless him.
To those, I'm interested to address the panel on this. To those of us who are in the hall who are parents, and my wife and I between us have got 4 daughters, all of whom are married, all of whom with children. It seems to me that the younger generation now is struggling very, very, very hard with all the mortgage costs, and just bringing up children generally now is extremely expensive, very fraught with a lot of difficulties. What does the panel think about the ability of the young generation or the younger generation to actually have the time to address a lot of the problems that have been raised today? Because it seems to me there's an awful lot of CV protection going on, and I can't disrupt this because it won't look good on my CV. It's a bit of a tragedy, but I think it's much more commonplace than we think. So those of us who attend functions like this, who are able to do that, who don't have maybe in our late 20s with a high-flying job to protect, I think it's a source of some concern that can we rely on the youngsters to actually be A, aware, and B, contribute to some of the situations that we now find ourselves in?
I think this is one of the most important and difficult questions that there can be around now. It's tougher than ever for young people to sort of get on the ladder anyway, get through university with all the enormous debt that they're left with, the intense difficulty of trying to buy somewhere to live, and how expensive a mortgage is for them anyway. And then children come along, and there's all that entails, and all the tremendous expense of bringing them up and seeing them healthy and trying to get them well educated and all of that. And it seems to me that there is a huge difficulty now. It's more difficult than ever before for these people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s even, to be able to pitch in and get totally involved with this new awareness that Ian expounds so tremendously well, and other people too. The energies of the younger generations are being sapped cruelly by what's going on now. I mean, my own grandchildren, university fees, they've come through university, they've landed with enormous debts. They cannot afford to buy a place, they go home to mummy and daddy, because it's just so difficult. It's much, much harder than it was when I was young and when I was first married. And I think we have a task to do, which is about helping this younger generation to reach this awareness and to feel supported by us. I think that older people have an enormous responsibility to these younger people who are struggling with such difficulties and increasing difficulties now. I think that in order for the whole movement and for the greater awareness to develop and extend, and for the communities linking up and making something happen, in spite of all the dreadful things that are being imposed upon us, the really frightening things, we need to really join up with the younger people and help and support them in every way we can, and to see these things and to care about them, and to know that there's a tremendous lot of us who do care and will support them in anything they can do.
Well, I suppose in some respects I'm one of those younger persons in a way. I work part-time and I do a lot of the other stuff I do voluntarily, so that, you know, I'm not kind of jeopardising my work, although I'm probably not taking the risks that some people are. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank my dear friend Mishu Godfrey, who makes it possible for me to do a lot of the things I do. And Mishu, if you're there, hope you don't mind my saying that, but she's an older person who's offered me that kind of mentoring and offers me the wisdom and support, and, you know, helps me have the courage to do some of what I do. And I have to say, I was very scared coming up here this morning to speak. And she gave me a lot of courage to do that, so I just want to honour that. Thank you.
Well, I'm one of those younger persons too. I certainly feel as though I've got a few years left in me anyway. Yeah, I mean, I have a range of children. They range from my son, who's 28, to my youngest son, who's 5, and there's a few in the middle as well. And I think, you know, I absolutely support what Margaret is saying. Our challenge is to support them in whatever they want to do. You know, one of my stepdaughters is a quantum physicist with British Aerospace. I certainly haven't wasted any breath trying to challenge her in her work. In fact, quite the opposite. I encourage her to do whatever it is that she finds enjoyable, rewarding, and I hope to God that one day, whatever it is that she works on, because funnily enough, the conversation is a bit stilted whenever we say, how's things going at work? Fine. But, you know, we're absolutely supportive. And, you know, one of my other daughters, she's right now in Hawaii. She's the perennial traveller. She comes back to this country for about 18 months every so often, works for Ernst & Young, who seem to think she does a good job because they keep holding her job open for her. And she's in Hawaii right now doing her diving instructor course. You know, I think that, you know, one of the things that we can do is encourage them to find balance, because I didn't have balance. I was deluded enough in my oil field career to think that what I was doing was meaningful. At the end of the day, I was a corporate whore. I was a very well-rewarded corporate whore. You know, the company said jump, and, you know, I said, how high would that be? You know, the company said your next salary check is in Dubai, which apparently is fine, provided you don't want sex on the beach. I thought it was a cocktail. But, you know, I think that I enjoyed everything, by the way. I enjoyed the hell out of my oilfield career. But I admit that I was deluded enough to think that what I was doing was meaningful. I mean, it was a means to a corporate end. You know, it was a means to a personal end because I was able to enjoy the sort of materialism that came with it. But at the end of the day, you know, the people who were really benefiting, obviously, were the major shareholders of the company. And, of course, they have benefited dramatically over the past 5 years, thanks to the oil stocks increasing by about 500% on average. But, you know, I think that, you know, we have to encourage them, because I actually see in a future, you know, where the older generation need to be much more reliant on the younger generation. I mean, I think, you know, we almost need to return to a point where the younger generation, you know, accept and acknowledge a responsibility for the burden of work, if you like. And when I say burden, my idea of a burden is the Steiner version, which is about 4 hours a day. Which, funnily enough, when you get outside of this mirage of Western society, is about what people tend to do. It's only in the West that we've created this obscene model, you know, where people think they have to work every hour God send to hold a family together. You know, we don't have to go back that far, do we? I mean, you know, my father, wasn't exactly in a high-powered job, but he worked his 40 hours a week. My mother didn't need to work, and we had leisure time as a family. My mother was always there when we were children. She didn't work until I and my sister had left home. That kind of pattern is not possible today, And I think this is something that we have to work towards trying somehow to return to. So I don't think there's a panacea here, because different offspring, different young people need different levels of support. And I think we should obviously encourage our children to reach their full potential, because at some juncture, they will go through, providing this hasn't been vaccinated out of them, they will go through the transpersonal process. And as I've said here before, anybody who's under 40 probably has no clue what I'm talking about. But it is very well documented now, but it's like getting a 12-year-old to read about the adolescence experience. They're not going to do it. It's something we have to experience, we have to go through. And I'm very, very grateful for the universe ripping the rug out from under me and reminding me that spending 40 years in the corporate world wasn't what I came here to do. 25 years was quite enough. And there was other stuff that I needed to be getting on with. And that, I think, is something that, we've lost touch with in the Western world. We've lost touch with this natural cycle of life. Actually, it's no surprise to me. It's something that, I haven't had a chance to expand on today, but it's no surprise to me that, the agenda of what we call civilization has absolutely been, over the past sort of couple of millennium, to try and destroy any indigenous peoples that have retained their connect with the wider environment, and try and keep people locked into their version of completely spiritually bankrupt materialism. But that's what I think we're at. We're at a juncture where we have an opportunity to return to that, and I think we can actually do a hell of a lot by helping to perhaps prepare our younger generation for this process, encourage them to embrace it when it happens, because as Lawrence said in his presentation, everything was ripped out from under him. This is the Tower Tarot card. If you do nothing else, go and read up on the Tower Tarot card. Because I think if we can actually stimulate that transpersonal process, that transformative process, we may actually get where we want to get to a little bit quicker. Thank you.
I read an article the other day, and it was about, I was appalled actually, it was an elderly gentleman who was criticising the younger generation, and he said their behaviour was absolutely awful, totally unacceptable, and went on fulminating for 3 or 4 paragraphs about how awful their behaviour was. And it was written by Socrates. Now, I am hugely optimistic about them, because I do meet quite a lot of them. And I'm hugely optimistic that they're just as good at what we did when we 50, 60, 70 years ago. And I can't accept that the impression that we get from our national newspapers is a true representation of what kids are like nowadays. I just do not believe it. There's one just off the road from us who is training to sail in the Olympics. And she sends her training schedule to me, and some of the top athletes in the world would pale into almost insignificance by reading what she has to do. And on top of that, she's doing all her A-levels and O-levels and things like that. So I am in total admiration of the kids nowadays. I think they're just as good as we ever were, and possibly a damn sight better.
Yeah, as somebody that doesn't have kids at all, it's interesting. I think I have 2 senses about this. One is that we will return to a time, not return, but we will rediscover the importance of elders within our community. I think that increasingly over the last 10, 20 years, the role of those that we call the elderly as a pejorative term, but they should be seen as our elders, and the wisdom of our elders will become more and more important, because a lot of us here will have gone through this process and will need to guide and mentor other people going through it. And I think that we've lost something very valuable in a society where we don't value that in people, where we see our elders, or the elderly as we label them, as a problem to be dealt with, as opposed to a resource and a wisdom to be tapped into and understood. Because as soon as anyone spends 5 minutes talking to somebody that is old, if you get somebody in school that, you visit, they have an old person come and talk to you about the war, and you realise that they did everything that we did, probably better, more extreme, whatever, when they were going through their, nothing changes, like you were saying, Socrates, nothing really changes. So from that sense, I think we need to rediscover that kind of source of wisdom and guidance. And the other thing is that I think that as the new generations come along, I mean, there's the whole phenomenon of indigo children and things like that, the layer that you have to scrape away to get to the wisdom underneath that's innate within these kids is thinner, and it gets thinner and thinner as the generations progress. Some of us have had to do quite a lot of work to get to where we are today, and it's still a long, ongoing journey, and it will be. But I think with a lot of the kids that are coming in now, they know this stuff. They don't forget it when they incarnate. They remember it. It's in there somewhere, and it's a lot easier to draw out of them. So I think when these changes come, I know it might not look like it because we get the knife crime, teenage louts, binge drinking, all of this. I think a lot of that is a reaction to a world that they know is wrong. It's, the world they're born into and living in is very, very far removed from how it should be. And there's a kind of innate knowing of that, but there's no guidance to say it should be otherwise. So they're floundering around in this morass of influences with nothing to... There's no anchor there. There's nothing to hang on to. And in the past, you would have got tribal societies that go and listen to your elders. They'll tell you what to do. That's the anchor that you hang on to, And with every generation that comes along, we should be looking for them to surpass us. That's the nature of evolution. We want the young to be better than us. We want them to be more aware. We want them to be more dynamic, more open, more sensitive, And we've got to nurture that and really, really let that flower. Because it's just there, and I really think it's just waiting for the opportunity. And once we get rid of a lot of the layers, however that comes, whether it's traumatic or otherwise, or and I think we go a great deal into how we respond to that is what will create that. But I think they'll be ready for it, and in a way that will astound and amaze us when this comes along. We'll just look, where did they get that from? So that's, I'm very hopeful about it. I think that the kind of what we're seeing in the dark side of things with all the problems that there are is just a reflection of the fact that, it's the shadow side of something that's waiting to blossom, and it will do.
I'd just like to, sorry, Jason. Yeah, absolutely, great comment. Yeah, but just build on something also that Linda was talking about today, because I think also we have a responsibility to teach our kids that food doesn't just appear on the shelves in Tesco's or Asda or whatever your local supermarket is. As I talked about this morning, I mean, for those of us that are grandparents, we can encourage our children to actually research for themselves. I mean, God forbid that any of us tries to tell our children not to get their children vaccinated, for example. But we can at least encourage them to research for themselves and understand, some of the concerns that have been expressed and are freely available to access on the web with regard to vaccinations. We can encourage them to look at the research that is increasingly available on kids that are fed junk food all the time. I mean, Jamie Oliver has made a tremendous job in trying to raise the standard of school meals, but unfortunately what he's done is he's put a lot of the kitchens out of business, I think. Because the kids are going down to McDonald's, or some of the more enterprising kids are phoning in the orders and getting them delivered through the school fence. But I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I'm not an advocate of saying, you know, stop all junk food. It's balance. It's a question of getting things in balance. But I think part of our responsibility is trying to, you know, re-educate our children that, you know, there are other sources of food. We can grow our own. Yeah? That should be, you know, and we can encourage the kids to, I mean, that's what I do, is encourage the kids to take an interest in growing their own. Encourage them to nurture the plants and feel, you know, the joy and the rewards that, you know, associated with seeing those plants develop into fruits and vegetables that they can then eat. You know, these are things that we've lost. You know, I didn't do that with my elder kids. I mean, my elder kids were the sort of missing generation there, and that's why, you know, I'm very appreciative that I've got the opportunity to do it again, you know, with my younger kids, and I can do things a little bit differently. I've got a little bit more time, you know, and I've got a little bit, perhaps more resource to be able to do this. So, you know, we're going to try and, you know, my partner is very supportive. Well, actually, it's probably the other way around. She takes the initiative, and, you know, I'm supportive of her. But I think that, you know, this is absolutely a primary responsibility. And to get involved in community. I mean, I was a member of the Boys Brigade, and every one of my peers was a member of either the Boys Brigade or the Cubs or the Girl Scouts or the Girls Brigade or whatever. You know, that doesn't happen today. You know, the kids are locked into playing bloody war games or whatever, you know, on the web, or filling out Bebo or Facebook. You know, I think the whole community aspect is a multi-dimensional issue, you know, that we've absolutely got to look at. And actually what appalls me is how quickly it's been wiped out. You know, because it's fundamentally, it's about one generation. So, you know, we've got a hell of a challenge. But, you know, if we pick up the gauntlet, it's certainly a challenge that we can rise to. I'm absolutely confident of that.
I'm so sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that we've got a particular incident here in Glastonbury at the moment, which I think is pertinent to mention. The kids have had a skateboard park for 4 years, and I think they had to campaign for something like 14 years to get it. And then the district council, in its wisdom, came along, I understand at midnight, or at least 6 in the morning, or something like that, on International Skateboarding Day, and demolished the skateboard park. And I mean, I just think that's absolutely atrocious. Now, it may have had some health and safety issues, but I think the thing is, it's like the beginning of the summer holidays, and to do it without any consultation whatsoever, I just think it's appalling. So I think also what we need to do is support the kids to stand up and say what it is they want, you know, and to find the ways to express their views to those councillors, council officers, and to recognise that, you know, we've got to put some resource into the kids. You know, it's going to cost, I don't know, 200,000 quid to replace this skateboard park. But, you know, we've got to find that, because otherwise the kids, you know, there'd just be no respect whatsoever, and understandably so.
It had to be closed as a matter of urgency. In previous occasions where there had been a lack of attention to detail, a child was killed. There's no way I'm going to have that in this town, okay? And it was closed purely for the safety of the children. Measures will be put in place to replace it, of course. But when life is at stake, as it was, we had to do something, okay?
Sorry, so was it a coincidence that it happened to be National Skateboard Day and at 4 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was that it was dismantled?
Does it really matter? I
mean, just call it a hunch, but it just seems an incredible coincidence that it should be National Skateboarding Day that the park is demolished.
Well, that's pure conjecture. I mean, that was not the, you know, that is not important. The central issue is it was not safe and had to be closed. That's all there is to it.
Tom.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Hello?
Yes, but this skateboard park was unsafe. Because of its construction, it was made of wood.
Let go. It's of non-importance to what we're talking about now. None so.
Well, I just want to say that I did mention health and safety issues, and I think the point is that we need to consult with the kids. That's what I was saying, and that's my point.
Can I just say, I think this point's been made, and yes, I think we should return now, and that can be discussed another time. Okay, so.
I think I make my point without the microphone. I'm from Holland, and this is a country that is in a certain way a bit more liberal than the surrounding countries, and I've been involved in youth work for about 20 years of my life. And the most difficult time was the time that we thought that there should be some of a distinction between the way soft drug users and hard drug users were used in justice. So in Holland there's a very extreme position of soft drug users. They're not considered to be criminals. They can smoke their stupid drugs, but they're not put in jail as they are in other countries around us. But the main thing that worried me from all these years of trying to defend this whole thing was that people said, hard drugs are so bad for the health of our children, and that's why we have to kill them all, in a way. This is not an argument. The argument is always, it's not safe, it's not safe. Well, I have 4 children, and the youngest is 7.5, but the oldest one is 24. And he was a dope addict for a long time. Just to piss off his old father, who's been in youth work, helping addicts, just to tell me that I was a shit-face. Okay, but after he got out of his own trouble, he has suffered his own pain. He's a beautiful guy, and he has his 24 years now, and he has grown by his experience. And I'm happy that he did not die in the time that he used drugs. Well, good. We're all happy that we don't have to face our children dying in any kind of kindergarten. But the main thing is, also these young people have to go through their own problems, through their own suffering, through their own silly ways of learning something. And that's what I say as an old father. I'm 62 now. We have to sort of, we say in Dutch, gun iedereen zijn eigen lijden. And that means give everybody what they need from the suffering. Because they need suffering to get somewhere.
I would absolutely concur with it. I did some work with Jelinek in the Netherlands in the latter part of the 90s. And I have to say, obviously, the enlightened approach to drug use and abuse in the Netherlands is far more enlightened than anywhere else in Europe. What I would say is that I absolutely concur with you that people have to find their abyss. It's very, very important. And we don't know at what juncture in their life that abyss, or they're going to go over the edge of that abyss. And obviously, it is a dangerous sport, and not everybody comes out the other side. And I absolutely concur again that the Netherlands is incredibly enlightened in terms of providing support for that journey. And I think there are a lot of lessons. And I mean, there is a book that I absolutely revere, and I'm struggling to think of the author. You may know the author. It's called In Place of the Self. And it's an absolutely superb book. Exactly, it's exactly the book. I couldn't remember it because I couldn't pronounce it. and absolutely, I would agree. And I think that your point is extremely valid, that we can learn a hell of a lot from the more enlightened approach, particularly in the Netherlands, in terms of helping people as they go through this crisis. I mean, in terms of the UK, the attitude here is, we slap them around the face and say, come on, snap out of it. And obviously we should actually be encouraging them to embrace the experience, to learn the experience. There is a downside, And unfortunately for those of you, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, for those of you who were at the Symposium last year, you saw a classic example of that on Sunday evening. Now, David is 1 year into what is very well documented as a 3-year process. And, one hopes that at the end of that 3-year process, and we hope he survives, because as I said, it's a dangerous sport and not everybody does survive, but we hope that at the end of that 3-year process, he's stronger for that experience and will once again, become a warrior.
Can we take another question from this side, please?
Hello. I'd just like to raise the point about localism. And over the last 10, 20 years or so, there's been a lot of talk about encouraging local things to happen, localism as I call it. At the same time, we've got talk of the formation of a world government, perhaps sometime in the future. I just wondered what your thoughts are on this. Do you think it's at all advisable or necessary? Thank you.
It's an interesting point that you make. I think localization, return to localization, is an important aspect, and it's certainly one of the initiatives that I think needs to be embraced. But at the same time, I think it's very, very important. I think I touched on this morning. It's very important that where community organizations are being established, that they are cognizant of what is occurring on a regional and global level, because otherwise the initiatives that these local community organizations are putting in place will be wiped out by the tsunami of global legislation. And that's why I picked up on Codex Alimentarius a year ago, because it actually struck me, despite the fact that natural health is not particularly my area of expertise, but what actually shocked me was the lack of awareness of what Codex Alimentarius entailed, and the lack of awareness, and I'll use the term loosely, but ignorance amongst complementary and alternative health therapists about Codex Alimentarius, and the fact that this is global legislation that's coming down through the World Trade Organization, down into the EU, and ultimately into national statute books. And Codex Alimentarius actually embraces concepts that would completely destroy everything that the likes of Transition Town are trying to introduce. So in some respects, those who are driving this agenda on a global level are very grateful to organizations like Transition Town, because it's actually keeping people's eyes off the ball. And that's the balance that we have to achieve. So we absolutely need to be doing exactly what Linda talked about in her presentation today. But we have to find a way to integrate the Transition Town and probably Hamish's parallel community into a wider network that actually understands the bigger political picture and then develops a strategy to try and counter that larger agenda. So I think this has to be a multi-pronged approach. It has to be multidimensional. There are no one-dimensional solutions to a multidimensional problem. And it's not simplistic in any way, shape, or form. And so, therefore, my hope is that as these community organizations become established, that they become a network of community organizations, and there isn't the competition between community organizations, but there is a symbiotic relationship, and they utilize each other's strengths. And this is absolutely critical. But at the same time, we have to also be aware, and this is where it's important to, at least have an open mind to those who are actually trying to research and understand what is going on at a very deep political level. And I'll give you an example of that. It's an organization called Common Purpose. And I would encourage you, if you're not aware of Common Purpose, to do some research on Common Purpose. And there's a very brave man called Brian Gerrish, who's seriously for the last 3 years, putting his head above the parapet to investigate this very pernicious organisation. And ask your local council, write to your local authority and ask them, under the Freedom of Information Act, to provide the information as to how much money that local authority has spent on sending their staff to courses that are sponsored by Common Purpose. Now, Common Purpose is being established in this country to effectively set up a parallel community, and I use the term, unfortunately, different to Hamish will. But like Phi Beta Kappa is in the US, it's a sort of an organisation that operates below the surface. And one of Common Purpose's stated requirements is to build a network where the loyalty is first and foremost to Common Purpose, not to your employer, not to your local authority. And yet local authorities are sponsoring people on attending these courses. And Brian Gerrish is at the front of driving this exposure. Now, Common Purpose is now going into schools. And it is trying to encourage schools to identify their best and their brightest, the future leaders. It is effectively trying to encourage them to embrace the Common Purpose, which is absolutely a global federalist, embraces a globalist and federalist philosophy. But it's encouraging the young people to come along to their courses and effectively be indoctrinated. Now, once again, this is the sort of thing that I don't want you to take anything that I'm saying at face value, because that's not ever my objective. My objective is simply to sow the seeds so that you might actually go out there and take a look at this for yourself, because nobody can tell you the truth. Right? You have to actually realize it for yourself. So there is no question that this is something that no one community organisation can survive alone. The community organisations are absolutely, in my opinion, the way forward. And over time, I see those community organisations, building a network, and that network then becoming a very powerful political force.
Can I recruit you for parallel community? Because that's precisely what we're doing. And the implication that we don't understand the problem about this world domination thing, World Bank, world this, world that, world the next thing. That's the reason that we set up this parallel community. Parallel community is not a separate organisation. It's not a separate organisation. It's a way of getting the 200, 300,000 organisations that already exist together, not to take them over, not to tell them what to do, but to say, look, we are here. If you have that problem, we know somebody over there has got the same problem, they've solved it, we'll put you together. That's the whole idea. And that's the only way you can get at the people who are trying to organise the world domination bit. We are acutely aware of it. You're not the only one in the world who's aware of it. There are tens of thousands of people, and we talk to them, a lot of them. And I am wildly enthusiastic, and hopefully there'll be a few people to listen to me tomorrow about this precisely this thing, because that's what we're doing. It's exactly what you're looking for.
I'm very aware of all this too, and about lots of little organisations around where I live in South London that are trying in their earnest way to do good things to help young kids not get into gangs and into knife crime and then shooting and drugs and all the rest of it. And little organisations for children who have dropped out of school or have been excluded from school. There's such a lot going on, and there are little pots of money here and there which go to help. But are they really helping? I don't think so, because there's so much disparity. This model of the ideals of the parallel community, linking people up, joining people together. There is one fantastic organisation in South London which is known nationally, Kids Company, and a lady who is half Persian and half Belgian called Camilla Batman-Gelid, who started off Kids Company in Southwark and has built up the most fantastic network of skilled professional people and mentors and volunteers, and they're working with huge numbers of kids now, and they're achieving wonderful things. They started off in a little railway arch with no money, and they have built this into something stupendous. I'm involved with one of the small organizations, very local to me, which is at the point now of just starting a holiday project for kids locally who have been referred from their school because of their very difficult behavior. And we're trying to do something for them. But I'm not content for it to rest there. I really want it to link up with Camilla's Kids Company and with other people around and join up the dots, because it's ridiculous that there are so many people trying to do little bits of this and little bits of that. And then there's the Evening Standard is still full of black kids knifing other black kids. You know, we've had 24 of them this year already, and it's not funny. And there is no, there's no such thing, it seems to me, as good news about these kids. It's all the bad news that gets exploited and put out everywhere. And you even get to a state where there can be copycat crime and all of this. And it's really harming our children and our young people so much. So I just want to endorse what Ian and Hamish are saying, and I think it's very interesting that this common purpose seems to have already a highly organized and clever way of doing this better than most people are doing it, in a more positive, more creative way. So.
I have a problem with this thing. It's a very interesting question that I thought you asked, because everybody talks about the dangers of a one-world government. And there's a little bit of me, and I haven't resolved this yet. I don't know the answer to this. It's still a thing that goes round and round in my head. There's a little bit of me that feels that actually we need a one-world government. Now, that might sound very contentious, but let me try and explain it. And this is, again, this is sort of work in progress. This is something I struggle with. The one world government that Ian talks about, and so rightly rallies against, is one of control and of subjugation and of using that to exploit people. And when, in the early days of looking into the crop circles, we started to sort of research this, it was quite a lot of us had the feeling that this was stuff coming from elsewhere. Yes, there's an interactive part of it. We are part of that process. We co-create them. But a lot of it was coming from where? Some people would label it as ETs, some people would label it as consciousnesses that are not of this place. And I can remember back in the 90s when there was the big ascension movement. The silver ships were going to come and whisk us away and everything was going to be fine, and it didn't happen. But I do have somewhere in the back of my mind, and I don't know where it comes from, a sense that we need to build a one-world governance of this planet based on unity, based on equality, and based on, for want of a slightly woolly term, love for our fellow humanity and for the planet itself. Because I think that when that happens, and it probably won't happen in my generation, in my lifetime, it might take us a long time, I think there is a raft of possibility and potential waiting somewhere for us to get our act together and to click into that consciousness. And then when that happens, that's when we'll start to see really what lies out there in our universe. So that's getting a bit, esoteric and a bit far off into the future. But I think one world governance based on a unity of consciousness where nobody on the planet will do something that harms others, that exploits others, because they know that it runs contrary to universal law. So in a way, I think we need a one world governance, but it's up to us to create the one world governance that we want, and not let somebody ride roughshod over us and steamroller us into something that's exploitative and that keeps us subjugated and just away from truth, really. And so, yeah, that was just my thoughts on that.
Linda, did you want to come in there? Did you want to say anything?
Well, I just wanted to say that I'm really looking forward to Hamish's lecture tomorrow because, I mean, I totally agree with what Ian's saying about Codex and its implications for food and genetics and genetic engineering and all the rest of it. And, you know, if we can raise awareness locally through the transition movement, then I think why not? And I don't think that, you know, Ian has to convince HQ down there in Totnes to necessarily make it a kind of a diktat. I think that individual transition initiatives, you know, they're not stupid, they're not daft. They're going to take this on board because it's important for their communities. But I do really look forward to your lecture, Hamish, because I think that I mentioned today in my my talk about, you know, our peculiar challenge is to create the structures that are going to facilitate this transformation, and in particular the attitudes that we need to bring to that.
Okay, thank you. All right, yes, there's a gentleman on this side, so his hand up a few times. Hold on.
Thank you very much. You can hear me fine. My name is Russ. I'm from Holland, like my neighbor, the good father. Thank you very much for sitting next to you. And your remarks, as well as each of you, gave me the idea to spend some time of your time in an idea I have and a suggestion, because the messages we hear and we see and we witness and only you have studied are written in the food. They're written in bread, actually. And I think that's a very main problem in the world, a lack of food. We hear 100 million children do not have enough food, or every second 2 children die of food, or every 5 get meningitis or sick because they have no food. Ian, you work in the oil business. I think you have seen it all. Recently, I read a book from Confessions of an Economic Hitman, how he explained how governments loaned a lot of money for infrastructure works and said they had not money to pay back, so they sold their children and their resources, everything, for the companies to pay back. What I have in mind is not perhaps a new idea, but I think here I have a very good community, the forum and the audience as well, and that's why I want to plant, if you allow me, in your brains the idea of a food train. If you take it in your mind, the idea that every child all over the world will get enough food, and you give it a food train, every day they have food enough. They don't have to work, they cannot be exploited, and it is an almost impossible idea to make work, because you have lots of enemies. The food companies do not like it. But still, I think if I give you the food train idea, and then the rest of your life, you see a train, you read a train, you hear a train, you say train, you think of the idea of a food train. And I give it the name and the sound of James Brown when he gets I'm a Soul Man. And if you think about it, the food train, that's in your mind. I would love to, that you, in your connections, in your networks, you will provide this idea, the possibility you can do it by region or by country, give food to the children, to the poor, and then you have you've solved a lot of problems. I think that's what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.
I just pick up on one point that you made. I like the idea. I'm not sure about the practicalities of it, but the idea is, an interesting one. You said there's not enough food. There is enough food. It just doesn't get to the right places. You know, we have criminal wastage. We have half the world, and I'm sorry if only Americans are here, but quite a lot of it is in America, are suffering from obesity. because they don't know when to stop consuming. And we have half the world in poverty. And one day we will all wake up and realise the insanity of that situation and the moral corruptness of propping up a system that supports that. But it's kind of one of those things that's a bit too difficult to do anything about, so we kind of give our 50 quid to charity every year and all the rest of it. That's where I think the big problem comes in, because we need a fundamental change of consciousness so that we cannot allow these things to happen. Not choose not to, it just can't occur because our consciousness won't let it happen. So.
For myself, I cannot explain to anybody in the rest of my life that I know and I did not do anything about the starvation of children all over the world. When I'm a rich man, I'm born in the West. That's why I'm rich. I have more food than I can eat.
Totally.
And I'm too rich, and I can give my money away, but it doesn't help.
Yeah.
I think that, first of all, the book that you discuss right now was Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, and absolutely is a work of reference that I would recommend. John Perkins worked for much of his life for the World Bank, and his job was to get third world developing nations into debt. And he knew absolutely that if he wasn't successful in persuading the governments of those third world nations to buy into his plans to get them into debt, the leaders or the leader of those countries would be assassinated and would be replaced by somebody who would sign into the World Bank's agenda. Absolutely a must-read, John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I concur with Jason. I mean, there is no question there is enough food. Absolutely no question. I mean, obviously, it's corporatocracy again. And with all due respect, the issue is, again, not one-dimensional. I mean, there's no panacea. But what I have to tell you is that, in my experience in the oil field, the most corrupt people that you find in the expatriate communities work for the UN, work for UNICEF, and work for, it's like, anybody remember Sergeant Bilko? Right? That is the UN without the humour. These guys are corrupt to the absolute nth degree. The problem is that we have actually, through corporatism, removed the will and the ability for these indigenous peoples to provide the food for themselves. So the food trains, all it does is it basically creates a dependency on the food trains. We've actually got to, and I know there are organisations in place which are helping these communities to recover the skills of being self-sufficient. But what has happened is, again, it's the agribusiness that has bought up the lands. And those lands are not being used to grow food for the local people. It's being used to ship, to the rich Western communities. Why? Because they can get more money that way. So this is one of the things about labelling. One of the things that Codex Alimentarius wants to do through the Food Labelling Committee, which is based in Canada, is ultimately abolish the requirement for food labelling. Not just so that, you don't know what's in it, but you don't know the country of origin. So that you won't have this option of saying, well, I'm only going to buy local produce, because you won't know. So, we've got, again, multi-dimensional issues going on here. And I think, we do have to live our truth. And one of the guys who, Andy, you have to get to speak at a future symposium is Dr. David Halpin. Because David Halpin is a retired orthopedic surgeon. And he is so incensed by what is happening in Palestine that since he retired, he has now used his accrued material wealth through his graft as an orthopedic surgeon in Torbay Hospital. And he has now made 8 trips to Palestine where he hires a ship. He's set up a charity now. It's called the Dove and the Dolphin Charity. And he is taking food and educational supplies out to Palestine, and he goes and supervises the distribution of the materials that he sends out there for himself, and he's built a network of local people. And to date, although the Israelis make his journey quite traumatic, and every time he comes back, he is completely depleted for about 8 weeks while he integrates the experience, because he's still trying to understand that as a man who has spent his life putting people back together, why it is that there seems to be an intent to destroy a nation. But, here's a classic example of a guy walking his talk. And, I think it is a tremendous example. And you're right. I mean, we have to find whatever it is that we can do, whatever our strengths are, whatever we feel motivated to do, whatever we have the resources to do, and put our energy into it. But, I think I have to concur with Jason that I don't know how this is going to pan out. But what I do perceive is a massive shift in realization, in consciousness, in interest. I mean, call it the awakening process, if you like. And it's something that is absolutely unstoppable. There is an inertia here. We haven't reached the 100th monkey yet. I don't know where we're at, but, we've still got some way to go. But I'm absolutely confident that, we're making the progress. And, we've got to keep that. We mustn't get disheartened, and it can get disheartening at times. Oh, my God, why am I doing this? But, we've got to keep at it, because ultimately we know we're going to win.
Just very quickly, on that point, if ever you wanted an example of the cynicism with which our governments treat us, a few years ago we had the beacon of hope that was Live Aid, that was going to eradicate the debt, from third world countries, that was going to write off a lot of this debt and start again. And very conveniently, what did we have in the middle of it? What put it off the rails and totally knocked it off the media spot that it was?
7/7.
7/7. And instantly, we've forgotten about it. And the only thing that made me think about that was that on the radio the other day, they were talking about the fact that they are still trying to get the governments to honour the agreements that they made, and shame on them for not doing it, and shame on them for using that, whether it was created or not, in order to wriggle out of something that's slightly inconvenient for them. And I think that actually, when people wake up to that kind of thing and they see that sort of cynicism, that's when it just gets sidestepped. That's when David Halpin thinks, right, up yours. If you're not going to help these people out in Palestine, I'm going to bloody well do it. I'm going to charter a boat. I'm going to get the supplies on there, and I'm going to go and do it. And would that all of us could walk a tenth of that talk, it would transform things totally. So yeah, I mean, if you get a chance to see him, he was at Alternative View. He is amazing, inspirational, and very hard to watch, because when you look at some of these things that are going on in our name, in the name of propping up the society that we are part of, it's got to be said and it's got to be done. So.
I think the encouraging thing is that there are literally hundreds and thousands of people in America who are doing exactly that thing. They're taking out their local problem. They're saying, up yours to Bush, we're going to do something about this. And this is it's called Blessed Unrest, Hawkins. And he's actually done some research on how many groups there are. And he says, it's absolutely astonishing. There are many, many hundreds of thousands all over the world, and they are just doing exactly that. They're hiring the boat, they're taking this stuff out, and they are not obeying the rules and saying, well, I can't do that, because this is what happens once you start doing a thing like this. And I've had experience with this, even with a minor thing like parallel community. And a lot of the reaction is, oh, you can't do that. Or, I think it's a great idea, and yes, but I don't want to come out of my comfort zone. And this is our huge problem. And the comfort zone is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as we speak. So we need more and more people to commit.
Can we take another question from this side? Yeah.
This might not be a very good question, but the way I understand it, the American Constitution is about 3 pages. The European equivalent is about 3,000 pages. And, does that not augur poorly for local initiatives in the future in the UK and Europe?
Yes. No, it's a problem. I mean, let's understand that. I mean, there's some great footage that was taken by some friends of mine in London, who they have formed a group. I mean, it's a growing group around the world. They're called We Are Change. And in London, of course, they have relatively ready access to the politicians. And they have actually caught both David and Ed Miliband. Now, don't forget that David Miliband is our foreign secretary. And they have caught David and Ed Miliband, and basically both have admitted that they had not read the Treaty of Lisbon. I mean, this is obscene. This is absolutely obscene. And they challenge them and say, don't you realise that you have handed away our freedom? And all that, Ed Miliband, all he can say was, I don't see it that way. And they say, well, have you read it? And he says, well, I've read enough. This is the great, the whole of Europe is set up as a bureaucracy. I mean, there is actually, parts of the legislation that are true doublespeak, and you actually have to plough your way through it. But, I mean, the Treaty of Lisbon reintroduces the opportunity for the death penalty to be reintroduced throughout Europe in time of war or in the run-up to war, with no definition of what the run-up to war means. There is also, in the Treaty of Lisbon, an opportunity for bureaucrats, for senior bureaucrats, to change the legislation without reference to the EU Parliament. So, this document, which hasn't been read, and it's been written in such a way that nobody obviously wants to read it, is totally about establishing a totalitarian federal state. And that's why, it is so important for the community groups to embrace, obviously, an external focus as well as the internal focus, because, there has to be that balance. And, I think that ultimately this is achievable. And actually, I think that once we find a way, and I think actually, if I look at the strategy, and it's not deliberate, I'm very conscious of that, but what we've got all of these community groups becoming established, right? And they've all obviously effectively got off the ground under the radar. If all of a sudden a network comes into place where there's a link without territory or ego, but there is a link between those groups, without fights over philosophy and ideals, but with focus on, if you like, the common ground, then all of a sudden those groups become a very, very powerful force. And consider a situation where even under current electoral processes, where these community groups are all able to identify people to stand in various constituencies, and they're able to mobilize the campaigning on behalf of those individuals who stand perhaps as independents. And then all of a sudden you've got 300 independents or 350 independents in Parliament. You've got a majority. In a heartbeat, from nowhere, you have the potential to change the whole arena. Now, at the moment, let me tell you that if we're not careful, the next election in this country may be the last. Because the other thing that is addressed in the Treaty of Lisbon is that by 2012, it will be illegal for any political party in Europe to campaign on the basis of nationalism. So parties like UKIP, Scottish Nationalist Party, Welsh Nationalists, etc., BNP, and so forth, will effectively be illegal. They will be barred from campaigning on their traditional agenda because the federalist state is effectively de facto in place. So, there may be the case that we have to try and initiate this process of bringing these community groups together. And like I say, the key issue, and this is the key challenge here, is to do it without attachment to dogma. Because that is what will break it. And that's what the guys, the away team, for want of a better term, that's what they are relying on. They are relying on the fact that, these groups will never get their act together. There's going to be infighting, and if there's not infighting, tell you what, we'll infiltrate it and make some. So, we've all got to try and step above that. And as soon as we identify behaviour that is not conducive with the wider agenda, deal with it. And we have to basically, effectively, take some tough decisions along the way. But I believe it is achievable. And I think your point is an extremely good point, because the sooner that we're able to actually highlight the threat to the community groups from the federalist agenda, which, by the way, is being driven from the World Trade Organization with their henchmen, the World Health Organization, and food, well, agricultural. What's the? No, sorry, I had a senior moment. But anyway, we've got the henchmen who are pushing the agendas down from on high. So what you've got is Codex is a classic example, because you've got effectively the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the World Food Organization, World Trade Organization, that's what I was thinking of, sorry. The World Trade Organization pushing what they call directives and regulation down. Now, regulation means that all of the countries who are signed up to the World Trade Organization have to implement that legislation effectively immediately. If they issue a directive, it means, look, you can go through the charade of making it look like you're making the decision on a local basis, but you're going to do it. And the closure of post offices, by the way, is a classic example of that. The closure of post offices is a diktat from the Treaty of Maastricht, which is 1997. But because it was a directive, then national governments were given the time to go through the charade of closing the post offices down. And yet people here still believe that it's something the British government controls. The British government is just going through the charade. So the more that can be done in terms of making the awareness of the pernicious intent of things like the Treaty of Lisbon, and encouraging these communities, these growing band of communities, to actually sit down and say, look, now is the time. Now is the time for us to look at how we can work together and actually be reflective on what are the barriers. What are the barriers that are stopping us working with the other groups? Are those barriers that we are creating because of an attachment to particular dogma? Is it barriers that we see in other groups that we've got to address? It's a tough time. But I absolutely believe in the fundamental ability of humanity to find a way through this.
I think that just about the most important message we need to put out there is that these things are achievable. Because I think the primary reason why a lot more people do not get involved in creating the change that we want is because they feel it is hopeless and that all their efforts are going to be wasted. I've come across this many, many times. What can we do? Who cares what we think? We have to be able to put across this is achievable. We can do it, and we will do it. You come with us, and you will have the joy of achievement as well.
I think it's a really interesting point that you raised, actually. It's not a bad question at all. I think that, from my understanding of it, the American Constitution was a document written by idealists who were intent on creating a better country, a better way of life. And it sought to enshrine certain rights and values and a level of respect, etc., etc. But,
On that point, one of the major things that they tried to make sure of was that government never had too much power.
Exactly. And it's interesting now, I think that in many respects, the American Constitution, although many of us look upon America as being the sort of the pariah in this, and it certainly is the way it acts, but the American Constitution is one of the most hopeful documents in its inception and its idealism that was ever written, whereas the Euro one is written by sort of grey-suited bureaucrats whose idea of inspiration is maybe to wear a slightly brightly coloured tie when they're going to work, you know. And it's that old saying, you get a committee to design something, they'll come up with a camel, you know. It's kind of like just layer upon layer upon layer of obfuscation and kind of, you know, it's the equivalent of that, you know, Find the Queen game, you know. It's like keep you looking whilst there's lots of stuff going on. So I think it's a really interesting parallel, and I think we need to get back to that original seed of the sort of keep it simple, stupid principle, you know, that there's, you know, these things aren't, none of this is rocket science, none of it's complicated. It could be enshrined in a page if we wanted it to. You know, we maybe need a kind of constitution for the world for a new age. So.
Okay, let's have a question from this side. All right, this lady's waving a hand the most.
I'm very interested in the last few questions that you've been talking about, and just disappointed that you're not mentioning what's going on in South America with the Bolivarian Revolution, particularly around Venezuela. Because since Hugo Chavez got into power, he's got more and more left-wing as he's had pressure put on him by the Americans, by the economic hitman. He's actually gone the other way. And there was a coup, and he was kidnapped, but the people came down, they surrounded the garrisons, they surrounded the palace, they demanded him back, they got him back. That was in 2002. There was, they tried to sabotage the oil industry. It's a very big oil exporter, Venezuela. They nearly succeeded. They destroyed the computers, but the people again went in, they sat in the buildings, and they got the oil industry back, as he's now finally, in 2007, producing what it was doing before all the sabotage. And this we don't get to hear about because it's not in the interest of the powers that be to let us know what's going on. But now he's got this free health care for everybody. He gave cheap oil to Cuba. The Cubans sent loads of doctors. The buildings were built by the actual people in the barrios, the little hexagonal buildings. They get full doctor pay in Venezuela, so they can send loads of remittances back, which are very helpful for Cuba, and Cuba would have been lost without this help by Venezuela again. Now, there's education. They used, again, the Cuban videos to get everybody. It's now been recognised by the UN that there is practically 100% literacy in Venezuela. Again, there's free breakfast, free lunches, free uniform. Everybody goes to school. All the older people go to school. There's loads of programs. The cataracts, he pays for people all over Latin America to go to Cuba or Venezuela, all from the Venezuelan oil money, to have their sight restored. It's Cuban doctors, Venezuelan money. He set up, because of the IMF, whose policies destroyed the Argentinian economy, and the Argentinians hated the IMF. He lent Argentina I think it was $5 billion, so they could tell the IMF where to go. So which they did, and now they can follow their own, with less privatisations and more welfare, and they love it. They love him for it. And then he resold. Of course, this was lambasted in the Western press. He's wasting the Venezuelan money, oil money, blah de blah. But then he resold all that debt, because Argentina had a higher credit rating because they weren't under the IMF, and he made a massive profit. What else is he doing? But he's always lambasted in England, in the Western media. I'm in a Venezuelan support group, VIC. We're constantly writing emails and letters to the press because they're always lambasting him. He's very passionate. He's Latin American. He's from the plains, and he called George Bush the devil at the UN, if you remember correctly. And it's just fascinating. He's giving loads of cheap oil to all the Caribbean nations on Petrocaribe. They have 25 years to pay. That's helping them help their economies. He's paying for Cuban doctors to go to Haiti. He gives oil to Bolivia. They just pay in soybeans. It's just... And now... practically all of Latin America now has left-wing presidents. Even Paraguay a few months ago, that had the most right-wing government ever, full of Nazis and everything. Now that's gone left-wing. There's only Colombia, which receives billions of dollars of American money that is now right-wing. And, of course, they're forever fomenting. I hear this from the Colombians all the time. And, you know, the paramilitaries are always killing off the trade unionists there, that they're always trying to make problems at the border, because that's obviously the way. They've tried sabotage, they've tried the coup, they've tried... the Venezuelan constitution, actually, is brilliant. He brought it in, the people had to vote on it. It is much better than the American constitution. And one of his things he wants to do is have 5% of the government taxes to go to community councils, which are just 100 families, because that's the way that he thinks the money works. There's a lot of corruption in middle management, and he wants the money to go to direct to the communities, and they work together and they make things happen. He's started a lot of agricultural schools, working from what the Indians are saying, all organic farming, because he doesn't like the fact that most of the food is imported, because that's...
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that, you know, he is somebody that we hear so little about. And
because they don't want us to know.
It's precisely because they don't want us to know.
He is a populist, he's a demagogue,
Ian,
he's a dictator. They love him in Venezuela, in the barrios.
Hang on. How long would you give it before they invade?
I think, you know, one of the great things about Latin America is they kept Spanish as the language, or Portuguese, obviously, in Brazil, but very few Americans speak Spanish. And believe it or not, that actually makes it much more difficult to sabotage in the oil industry in particular. You know, because most of the saboteurs that the CIA can bring to bear are monolinguist. So, you know, they're not able to ingratiate themselves into the industry there. And there's no question that, you know, that there is a common denominator between all of the countries that Bush and his cohorts label the axis of evil. And that common denominator is that they are all free of debt from the World Bank. And Latin America, as you rightly say, I mean, has, thanks to the foresight of Chavez, effectively become free of debt from the World Bank. And right now, there are no question that the right-wing think tanks are still out there trying to establish a way of subjugating Latin America. Say again? The Bank del Sur, the Bank of the South? What's that? Okay, yeah. I mean, you know, the reality is that Chavez's greatest challenge is going to be to identify his successor. You know, because it's like Tito, you know, in Yugoslavia. Because otherwise what happens is then, you know, the powers will simply hang around on the borders and wait for their opportunity. They know that Chavez has the popular support. I mean, he is effectively a benevolent dictator. You know, yes, absolutely. He was voted in, right? But he is a benevolent dictator. I mean, the guy was in London and the British media didn't report it at all. You know, no, the guy is a hero. There's no question about that. But he's also, excuse me, sorry, hang on a second. Yeah, we listened to you. You know, but the guy is buying that loyalty. I mean, do you know how much it costs to fill up your tank with petrol in Caracas? 8 cents. 8 cents. Now, Chavez knows that he's got a real problem, actually, because he needs to raise that, because the subsidy that the Venezuelan government is putting into providing petrol and diesel to the people is actually potentially financially crippling. So he's actually also creating problems that he's got to deal with. Now, I do think that he and the team working with him are incredibly creative. But, you know, this process of transformation is not going to be easy. And like I said, you know, don't underestimate the fact that Chavez has to find a credible successor, you know, a successor that can take over that mantle. I mean, he is doing an amazing job in Latin America of separating Latin America from the pernicious agenda of the World Bank. And I mean, if you go to Cuba, you know, the Cuban students, I mean, they think Castro is a hero, and I think rightly so. They think Castro is a hero, but the primary reason for believing that Castro is a hero is that he's kept Cuba out of the clutches of the US, you know, for the past, 50, nearly 60 years now. And, you know, and obviously, once again, I mean, Castro hasn't been seen in public for a long time. And I think Cuba recognizes that it potentially is going to have a constitutional crisis unless they are able to identify a credible successor that the people absolutely and unequivocally throw their weight behind, so that they can carry on and build on the developments of Castro, and now with the support of Chavez. So they are amazing achievements. But I mean, you know, once again, let's put them in perspective. They haven't come at zero cost. And the other thing is that, you know, Chavez right now is trying to encourage entrepreneurial spirit. You know, he is absolutely embracing that. He's encouraging people to be self-sufficient. But he's also got to try, over the next few years, to reduce the phenomenal burden of social support, social services. But primarily, that burden is linked to the phenomenal subsidies of providing fuel for next to nothing.
Okay, now, no more questions, I'm afraid, because we're nearly out of time. So what we're going to do is our traditional close, where we ask each panel member to just basically sum up their feelings about the signs of the times, which, hey, this conference is about. So we need to close. So these are your closing words, so make them good ones. We'll go from whoever. Hamish is reaching for a mic, so we'll start with Hamish and then run along to Jason. Hamish.
My problem is I didn't hear what you said.
Just get on with it and say something. Closing words, something meaningful and lovely.
I love this conference because it's very strange, actually, because I started thinking about what I was going to say at the beginning of the week, and I thought I'll get something absolutely way out so that nobody will steal my thunder. And already everybody said everything I was going to say. So don't bother coming tomorrow.
Oh, this is a difficult one. I've got so many feelings about the things that we've heard tonight and the speakers have said today, and so much else that's going on around. I was listening to Jason very carefully and about the ideal idea of a one world government, and the sort of very down and depressed bit of me says, haven't we got that already, given that there's so many the most powerful people on the planet doing terrible things that we're very well aware of. And although it may be small in numbers, the power of them is so great that it makes me wonder whether we aren't getting closer to that. And it is very frightening and very disturbing, and all the more it makes me feel so strongly that we must keep our own hope and optimism and faith in really good repair and encourage others to join us and just say, you know, you can do it and we can do it together. Don't despair. So many good people are out there doing a lot of wonderful things, like the Dr. Hopkins was helping. That's right, and Chavez, God bless him. And you know, it doesn't have to be like this. We must get away from the feeling of despair and our own powerlessness, and that is the way forward, and that is the way that hope lies.
Oh, where to start? You know, I mean, I've been, I guess, stepping out of my comfort zone since the immediate aftermath of 9/11. You know, when I watched 9/11 unfold, and I was sitting in a beach bar in Belize in a lovely village called Placencia that I'd made my home for the previous 7 months. And I think watching that, I realized that from that moment onward, the world had changed. It actually took me another 6 months before I was totally convinced that I had researched it to sufficient depth to know that it was an inside job beyond any reasonable doubt. And I knew from that moment onwards that I just had to share that view. Well, it got off to a rocky start when my best mate basically came by my house and saw what I was researching, and he said, "Oh, you're not still looking at that 9/11 shit, are you?" He said, "Oh, come on, Ian." He said, that happened exactly the way we're told it happened. I mean, all this stuff is just conspiracy." And I said, "Look, I don't want to fall out with you, Lee. So we'll just agree to differ." Well, a few months later, he found a DVD. He came by my house and he found a DVD, and he said, "Oh, what's this?" And I said, "Well, why don't you take it away and look at it?" Well, I'd forgotten about it, to be honest, but about 6 months later, he and his wife came to dinner with me. And we had a whole bunch of people around the table, and his wife nudged him halfway through the dinner and said, "Haven't you got something you want to say to Ian?" And he said, "Oh, later. And she said, No, tell him now," like in front of all the people we had at the dinner table. And he said, "Okay." He said, "Ian, you know all that stuff you've been researching on 9/11? I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you're absolutely bloody right, and you need to be getting out there and spreading the word." And it was he, because I was sort of like, well, okay, this is a great turnaround. But he actually did more than that. He actually booked my first 3 venues, and he just told me, he said, "Oh, by the way, I've booked these venues and you're scheduled to speak, and the subject is 9/11. And when I started doing that, we were speaking to small groups of people, and in most cases, people were sort of coming out of curiosity. But what I've seen over the past few years, and the way in which my circle of friends has completely changed. I mean, I don't associate with anybody today since coming back to the UK in 2001. I've been out of the UK for nearly 14 years, and I don't associate with anybody from my pre-departure days. My circle is completely new, and fundamentally, my community is built up of people, like Andy, like Jeff Stray, my friend Lee, and so Simon. People that have come together because we share a vision. Now, we don't have an existential commitment to a particular vision, but what we do know is that there is a growing, and I'll use the word loosely, army of people who share that vision. And whilst that vision may not necessarily be identical, we know it's a very different vision from the one that is being presented to us by those who currently control the information mediums. And I am seriously heartened by that. It's wonderful to come to events like Glastonbury. I was speaking at an event in Liverpool in May, a wonderful audience there, and whereas once upon a time the Symposium was the event, the Symposium is still the primary event and will certainly always have a place in my heart. But what is fascinating for me is that there is a growing interest in these subjects, in this breadth and depth of these subjects. And that is what absolutely convinces me that we're going to break through. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I just know it's going to happen. And you guys are part of it.
I'd just like to say that I think this whole issue of political literacy and participation and representation, I think, is crucial. I think it's really key. And I just want to honour a best friend of mine here, John Cousins, who this time last year, or thereabouts, encouraged 14 of us here in Glastonbury to stand as independents under the banner of Glastonbury United. And that was an amazing experience. And he said, if you love Glastonbury and it's the last thing you'd want to do, then you're the perfect candidate. And so 14 of us stood, and it caused quite a stir, actually. And in the end, 2 of us got elected. And I have to say that it has really changed the tone of the conversation in the council chamber. And Sheila mentioned earlier that, she felt for the first time, perhaps in this town anyway, represented by somebody that she'd voted for. So I think, we can all do that. And I would echo what Ian said about, we could stand. And I'm not sure whether the system itself has totally had it, but if it hasn't, then it just needs some kind of replacement of the personnel, really. And I think there are... It's all a brand new world to me. I'm not a political animal, but I just got fed up of not hearing the kind of issues I wanted to be addressed, being addressed. And I thought, well, you know, if not us, then who? You know. So I have to say, I missed election in the first time by a few votes, and I was hugely relieved, I have to say. But then I went to every council meeting between May and then there was a by-election in September. And well, John and a few others encouraged me to stand again. And this time, the powers that be in this town, shall we say, really tried very hard to keep me out. But they didn't manage. And I was elected again by a few votes. And I just think that, you know, we've really got to start putting our money where our mouths are and equip ourselves with the knowledge and the information and the skills and the allies and all the rest of it that's going to make us feel comfortable to take those kind of steps. And I would encourage you to do so.
Cool. Yes to all of that. I think for me, signs of the times where we're at, it's that increasing sense that it starts with the heart. It starts with getting this right. You know, we're moving into a time where there isn't time to deal with all the usual crap that we deal with. You know, we're moving into a time of instant manifestation, instant karma, if you like. You know, the stuff that we put out comes back at us now so quickly. It's frightening sometimes. And I think what we're being given increasingly, as things seemingly get darker, are the tools to transmute that. And I think that one of the feelings I have about humanity is that one of the things that makes us unique is our ability to consciously manifest love and to consciously transmute negativity. There are other beings on the planet that do it kind of instinctively, places that do it for us, but we can do it consciously. We can direct our consciousness to that end, and I think that's part and parcel of what we're experiencing now, is that ever-accelerating sense that we're coming to that point where that will become natural to us. But in the run-up to that, we need to work on that, train ourselves, if you like, and remember all these techniques and things that we've forgotten in order to see things through. And I think it's an incredibly exciting and hopeful time that we live in, because we have the potential to create something wonderful. And it's not often that that comes along. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree that was a very, very interesting evening, especially if you were the mayor of Glastonbury. Sorry about that. Thank you ever so much for coming. For those of you who are joining us tomorrow morning, 9:15 in here for the official opening. We look forward to it, followed by some strange man called Andy Thomas talking about how to be a subversive. So look forward to that. If you're not coming again tomorrow, thank you for joining us today. But I'd like you to give a huge thank you to our panel. Give them a massive clap. Thank you.